Okay. Well, if he pops in and out, like I said, that shouldn't be a problem. I'll watch the waiting room, make sure that we catch him. But let's get going here. Okay. Good evening. Thanks for joining us, Alice and Professor. Today, we're excited to discuss our comprehensive report on how New York State can tackle climate change through its purchasing power. Climate change is an urgent global challenge that demands immediate action, and New York State has a remarkable opportunity to drive positive change through its substantial purchasing capacity. Our goal was to conduct extensive research and develop robust recommendations that effectively utilize New York State's financial transactions and relationships with banks. To achieve this, we thoroughly analyzed precedents from other jurisdictions that have successfully used contract incentives to shape desired business practices. Additionally, we examined the financial relationships between New York State, New York City, and major banks to build a solid foundation for our proposed policies. Our objective is clear. We want to use New York State's purchasing power to incentivize banks to adopt sustainable practices, contributing to the fight against climate change. By leveraging financial relationships with banks, New York can create a powerful mechanism for promoting climate-conscious business practices. Ultimately, through this, we believe New York can set an example for others to follow, encouraging regions and states worldwide to take actions at the local level. So before we dive in, we should introduce the speakers, the ones of us presenting. I think you've met most of us, but just in case, my name is Jennifer Prather. I'm the CEO of a rural broadband provider here in Texas.
My name is Lucas Cabral. I'm the legislative assistant for the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials here in Washington, D.C.
My name is Marquise Lawrence. I am an educator, and I've been taking steps to join the policy analysis arena.
My name is Noah Zecker. I am a planner with the city of Cedar Rapids.
So just as the agenda, we've gone through a little bit of an introduction. We'll talk about what we have found in our research through red states and blue states, and then move on to our recommendations.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. So I want to kick it off with having a brief overview on the exploring New York State's banking relationship and green banking initiative. So right now, there's an assortment of banks that New York State collaborates with for its financial needs. And these banks play a really integral role in our financial landscape, from serving as depositories for state funds to underwriting bonds for various projects and initiatives. So I want to just do a brief overview on these types of banks. Depository banks. New York State right now partners with a very large, diverse range of depository banks to handle essential banking services, which could include custodianship of our funds. And among these are really well-known names: JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup. And these banks are truly the backbone of our financial transactions. We have bond underwriters and services. In the pursuit of progress, we frequently collaborate with banks for bond underwriting and related services. Similarly, with depository banks, a lot of very familiar names on that group. But then we also have green banking initiatives. Now, what I think is particularly interesting is that many of these depository banks are also making strides in green banking. They're adopting initiatives that support sustainability and environmental responsibility, from financing renewable energy projects to integrating environmental risk assessment into lending practices. These initiatives are contributing ultimately to a more eco-conscious financial sector. So as we embark on the discussion of green banking, I think it's really important to acknowledge the challenges that lie ahead. And these challenges can include combating the risk of greenwashing through transparency and evidence-backed claims, establishing standardized metrics for measuring environmental impacts, and ensuring our efforts encompass comprehensible, sustainable practices from lending to investment. And we also have rigorous evaluation of environmental risk lending, balancing financial goals with sustainability, and integrating social and governance factors. All demand truly our thoughtful consideration. And a deeper exploration of these challenges can be found more in the accompanying memo as we guide through the topics toward a more ultimately sustainable future. But I want to pass it over to my colleague Noah, that'll be providing the next point of our introduction.
Yeah, for this next section, we're going to take a little analysis of what climate action multinational banks involved with New York State have done so far. The Banking on Climate Chaos report revealed that the world's largest 60 banks have provided $4.6 trillion in financing for fossil fuels since the 2015 Paris Agreement. Despite a plateau in fossil fuel financing in 2021, the overall trend since the Paris Agreement remains upward. A significant gap exists between banks' aspirations for net zero emissions, or their claims for it, and their actions, with many banks still funding projects that contribute to climate change. Although 44 out of the 60 banks committed to achieving net zero by 2050, they continue to finance activities like the opening of new oil and gas fields, potentially prolonging climate warming emissions. Banks fund climate change by providing loans, insurance, and financing to fossil fuel companies supporting activities that emit greenhouse gases. They also fund specific projects such as coal mine expansions and new oil rigs, which contribute to climate impact. These financing decisions shape the future, and the infrastructure funded by banks will endure for decades. This means that banks hold the power to either drive a fossil fuel dependent future or accelerate the transition to greener alternatives. Despite some actions, big banks involved with New York State claim to be strongly in favor of climate-friendly action. In this case, we will look at JP Chase, Bank of America, and Citigroup's claims. Because the worst climate harm caused by the banking industry is on a macro scale and hard to track, exact refutation of their claims is difficult. However, we do know that JP Chase was the biggest financier of fossil fuel extraction from 2015 to 2021, and Citigroup is the second largest fossil fuel financier globally, giving us clear reason to doubt their claims. This is somewhat skewed by their size and relative to other banking organizations globally, but still pretty good reason to be a little bit skeptical. JP Chase's 2022 ESG report claims a substantial $1 trillion green objective aimed at addressing climate change and sustainable resource management. They go on to state diverse green activities encompass action toward green activities encompassing renewable energy, clean technology, sustainable transportation, water management, and try to reflect an overall integrated approach between internal and external sustainability. Bank of America's dedication to low carbon economy is through strengthening of their Sustainable Global Solutions Group. Their global position in ESG debt issuance signifies engagement in sustainability. The establishment of their corporate governance, ESG, and sustainability committee, they claim further showcases their intent for responsible governance. Citigroup's creation of specialized teams in restructuring efforts, they say highlights their commitment to sustainability and clean energy transition. Their emphasis on capacity building through training demonstrates proactive engagement. However, the lack of evidence-based claims in Citigroup's reports is telling. I'd like to pass it on to Jennifer from here.
Sure, thanks, Noah. So many states, liberal states, have attempted to influence the social or environmental behavior of organizations via regulatory approaches. We examined the state's attempts to influence BDS behavior, to work against the gun industry, and in favor of diversity and pro-climate actions. So go to the next slide, please, Lucas. California, for just a couple of quick hits with more detailed analysis to follow in our memo, California introduced a legislation in 2023 to require companies with earnings of over $1 billion to disclose emissions information. Similar requirements could be legislated in New York to require banks to disclose their pro-climate actions. In 2016, California passed an assembly bill that requires companies to certify compliance with 2 California anti-discrimination laws in order to be able to submit a bid or a proposal or to enter into a state contract worth $100,000 or more. The initial draft of this bill included a stronger public contract ban against anyone who boycotted Israel, but due to legal concerns regarding the unconstitutional punishment of free speech, it ended up more limited in scope. Similar concerns could impact New York's ability to outright ban banks from participating in contracts for state business with bad climate ratings or scores, but should still allow a points impact during the bid process. Looking at Maryland, they also introduced a bill to expand equity and better ensure corporate diversity. It requires an entity in the state to demonstrate a level of diversity in its leadership or mission in order to qualify for any state benefit of greater than 1 million, such as a grant or a contract or a tax credit. It also requires the State Department of Commerce to develop a state report scoring that diversity data. Similarly, New York could pass legislation requiring the state to create a report on the climate scores of each bank and to require a specific score from the report for banks to be able to qualify to respond to RFPs with the state. Finally, not on here, but the state of Connecticut also requires banks to disclose any ties or investments with the gun industry prior to obtaining state contracts for loans, lines of credit, or bond work. And while not directly impacting points in an awards process, that could be a step in that direction. And now Marquise is going to tell us what we learned about some of the red states.
Thank you, Jennifer. So, as we've learned, conservative states have started to use their political and economic influence to start to enact different investment policies that tackle policies that they perceive to be woke. And that encompasses a lot of different things because it's not clearly defined. And we can go on to the next slide. But as blue states have become more involved, as well as the federal government, in implementing ESG rules and regulations, red states have decided to try and counter that as well. And so they've implemented actions not just against banks, but against local governments and municipalities, insurers, and their own state pensions to kind of counteract that sort of funding. A lot of red states are very small and do not have the economic or political influence to really change these investment policies. So states like Wyoming and Iowa have tried, but banks essentially ignore their rules. And Texas and Florida, on the other hand, actually do have the economic influence to implement and kind of bully banks around. So we will be focusing more on them. And so they are leading the charge, especially Florida. Florida has tried to band together with lots of other smaller conservative states to help them implement similar legislation, which would force companies and banks and other groups to invest in fossil fuels, to invest in gun manufacturers, and to ban social crediting scores. Unfortunately, for the people within those states, there have been consequences that have already been seen, such as higher interest rates for municipalities, banks exiting these markets entirely due to these regulations. And because of that, it is important to look at these case studies and note that even though these are large economies that can influence banks and banking systems, they themselves are being hurt by regulating in ways that are adverse to the directions financial institutions want to move in. And so while New York and other states are doing things that are more favorable to these institutions, it's still important to note that when you completely ban or force banks to do things, it can lead to economic penalties or injuries to the state and the people within.
Great. So I'll kick it off with our recommendations, starting off with our recommendation number 1. So our proposal entails integrating eco-friendly ESG criteria, similar to how Marquise mentioned in other states, into the bank selection process for those aiming to offer services to New York State, facilitated through legislative implementation. We think through this approach, potential legislation would establish distinct benchmarks focusing on environmental stewardship, social responsibility, and ethical governance. And by doing so, we think New York State can harness its own economic influence in shaping future financial relationships that are pivotal in cultivating a more climate resilient economy. So very briefly going over ESG criteria breakdown. So for environmental, so this dimension would assess a bank's commitment to reducing its environmental impact. It encompasses carbon emission reductions, energy efficiency, water management, waste disposal practices, and contributions to climate change mitigation. There's social. Banks would be evaluated based on their interactions with stakeholders. This would include employees, customers, suppliers, and communities. And the parameters would include labor practices, diversity and inclusion, customer satisfaction, and community engagement. And then we have governance. This element would examine a bank's internal structure and decision-making process. And the criteria would include ethical business practices, transparent reporting, executive compensation alignment with sustainable goals, and diverse and independent board compensation. So how would this look like, and what would be the things to put this in action? Now, we propose that any bank seeking to provide services to the state must demonstrate substantial compliance with the outlined ESG standards. Now, when it comes to effectively implementing this recommendation, we think there's a careful consideration and key steps that we outline in our memo on factors that we think are crucial throughout the process. So we established this 10-step process, and I'll just be going over each step briefly. So starting off, we have a legislative framework forms the cornerstone of this process. By enacting comprehensive legislation, we would establish specific ESG parameters and allocate weightage to each in the assessment process. We think this robust framework would guarantee clarity, consistency, and enforceability in the pursuit of sustainability. To ensure a uniform evaluation process, clear and measurable standards we think are really critical. We propose relying on established ESG reporting frameworks and recognized metrics. So by doing so, we would enhance transparency and comparability, making the evaluation process more effective and reliable. Then we have transparency and accountability, which are very integral components. Banks would be obligated to periodically disclose pertinent environmental, social, and governance data. And this data transparency approach would enable continuous monitoring, allowing New York State and its legislature to ensure that its financial partners adhere to ESG criteria consistently. We have enhancing the credibility of our evaluation process. So we suggest involving impartial verification bodies or auditors. These external entities would rigorously assess banks' claims regarding ESG performance, bolstering the legitimacy and reliability of assessments. There's acknowledging the complexities of adopting ESG practices. A gradual adoption and transition period we think is best. This approach would allow substantial amount of time for folks and banks to adjust their strategies, which would encourage a smooth and effective shift towards ESG compliance. To foster commitment and alignment, our framework can encompass, or the legislative framework can encompass incentives for exemplary ESG performances and appropriate disincentives for non-compliance. This balanced approach would encourage sustainable practices and discourage deviations from the set criteria. Engaging with key stakeholders, we think, is paramount. Active involvement with financial institutions, environmental organizations, regulatory bodies, and the public fosters essential support, cooperation, and inclusivity. And NYCC's collective efforts can lead to a more effective and impactful implementation as well. We recognize that capacity building is also very pivotal. By offering capacity building programs, we would essentially empower banks to align their operations with ESG principles effectively. And this support would equip them with the tools and the needed to enhance their ESG performance. Then we have collaboration with business industry associations, which hold immense potential. Encouraging these associations to develop guidelines and initiatives for their member banks fosters a more unified commitment to ESG integration, which would drive widespread positive change. And lastly, we have proposing the incorporation of periodic evaluation mechanisms. This would allow New York to assess the effectiveness of the ESG criteria and the impact it has on banks that are practicing it. Continuous evaluation, we believe, ensures adaptive progress towards the sustainability goals, allowing for a timely refinement and improvement. But in sum, on this slide, we think a comprehensive and coordinated approach guided by these key steps and consideration would help ensure a more successful implementation of our recommendation. And through these measures, we would be able to shape a more sustainable financial landscape that aligns with our climate resilient aspirations. And within our memo, we dive a little bit deeper into specific state legislators that have either introduced or co-sponsored legislation relevant to ESG and eco-friendly sustainability measures. And within the memo as well, we have links to these specific legislations as well. So these are just a few of the many folks that we've identified that we encourage NYCC to collaborate with when considering the introduction of such legislation. But I do want to answer one very simple question. Why hasn't something been implemented already? And what are some things to be very mindful of when pursuing legislation tackling this issue? So touching on these topics, we have complexity. Implementing ESG criteria requires really careful consideration and planning. Defining specific benchmarks and developing measurement metrics and even setting up transparent evaluation processes is really complex and can be extremely time consuming. We have stakeholder engagement. Engaging with a variety of stakeholders, including financial institutions, regulatory bodies, and the public is essential but difficult. And gaining their buy-in and addressing concerns will take time. We have public support and awareness. Generating awareness and building public support for ESG integration is crucial. And New York can engage in educational campaigns, or not just New York, but organizations can provide educational campaigns to ensure the public understands the benefits and rationale behind the recommendation. We have industry adoption and adaptation. Banks, financial institutions, like I mentioned, they need time to adjust their operations to meet the proposed ESG criteria. It's not going to be smooth sailing from start to finish, unfortunately. And they might need some time to develop new strategies, invest in technology, and train their staff. We have political and economic considerations. Political dynamics and economic conditions are ever changing and could influence the timing of implementation of such legislation. Balancing economic growth with sustainable practices is a really delicate consideration. And lastly, we have resource allocation. Implementing ESG criteria involves a lot of resources, including financial ones, technology, and human capital. And allocating those resources amidst the competing priorities can be extremely challenging. So in sum, this is our first recommendation we have, but I want to pass it over to my colleague, Noah, who will be touching on to our second recommendation.
Thank you, Lucas. For the second recommendation, let's explore the potential of incentivizing climate risk management in large banks through a weighted scoring approach within the request for proposal process. This strategy aims to align lucrative New York State financial services contracts with the imperative of addressing climate change by incorporating weighted evaluation criteria into the RFP process. We can encourage banks to prioritize and proactively address climate risk assessment and mitigation. The New York State financial services contracts are extremely lucrative for organizations that have the capacity to undertake them. This approach involves leveraging those lucrative contracts by assigning specific weights or points to climate-related criteria during the evaluation process. The intention is to elevate the significance of climate risk management practices and incentivize those major institutions to take more substantial actions by making them compete with each other to gain these contracts. There are some key steps for consideration. If you go to the next slide for me. Thank you. This policy would require banking-related RFPs to allocate additional points to banks based on their positive climate-specific policies, encompassing both internal sustainable practices and investment policies. A structured framework is essential to ensure consistency and fairness in evaluation. The allocation system must have precise and quantifiable benchmarks for evaluating banks' climate risk management initiatives. From sustainable office practices to climate-conscious investments, these standards must span a range of climate policies, ensuring transparent evaluation. The policy must place significant emphasis on third-party verification and auditing of banks-related climate efforts to avoid greenwashing. This external validation process ensures the integrity and credibility of the point allocation process. There are some difficulties with this approach, however. Ineffectivities in collecting and reporting relevant data for climate risk assessment could lead to inaccuracies. In addition, the primary focus on climate risk management might overlook other crucial ESG factors that the first recommendation could more effectively address. There could also be concerns that implementation and reporting costs may favor larger banks, lessening competition, though the size of the contracts makes this less of a concern, as any bank applying should be able to compete in this space. Overall, implementing weighted scoring and banking services RFPs for New York State offers several benefits. It strengthens climate resilience, enhances sustainability, improves financial stability, and attracts responsible investments with public funds. Most importantly, for this approach, because it focuses on bonuses in the RFP process and not restrictions on banking practices themselves, it may be permissible for New York City to also engage in this space, which would be highly beneficial. That's all I have for the second recommendation. For the conclusion, I'll pass it on to Marquise.
Thank you, Noah. So as we've seen throughout this presentation, we've seen both conservative and liberal states are beginning to take action to enact different regulations and policies. Conservative states are often taking more extreme actions to completely prevent investment policies that they do not agree with. Blue states are moving in the opposite direction, but not as extreme as how red states are doing it. The federal environment currently does favor the blue state approach, but that may change depending on the elections. So the recommendations that we presented for New York incorporate ESG criteria and will allow the state to become the Florida or Texas equivalent for ESG implementation and to set the example for other states to improve investments to combat climate change. The weighted scoring system would place pressure on banks because, as we saw earlier in the presentation, many banks are still investing billions in fossil fuels. And if you completely force them to drop those actions, we've seen from other states that there can be potential economic injuries. But with the point system, it could lessen or end these potential injuries to the state and to its people. Once successfully implemented, New York's political and economic influence will help other states to implement similar regulations and help our nation contribute to global efforts in combating climate change and push us to a brighter and better future for the upcoming generations. And at this point, if there are any questions, we are here to answer them.
This is so awesome, guys. Thank you so much for all the work that Cooley went into it. This is super informative. I don't have any questions right now. I wouldn't mind reaching out again after sitting down and reading the memo, to be quite honest. So that would be great if you guys can continue to be in touch. But this is super, super helpful. I also wanted to pass on an update, which is that the section that you guys put out about the potential legislators to partner with was super great. It's great that you guys have done an analysis so we don't have to. We also have a relationship with James Sanders Jr., who is actually the chair of the banking committee in the New York State Senate. He's not listed here because I don't think he's like introduced something like this before, but he's the chair and we have a relationship with him, and we're actually considering approaching him to co-sponsor, since his sponsorship would be very powerful, being that he's the chair of the committee that this would go through. So but this is also super helpful because now we know the people that we should approach immediately to co-sponsor after, hopefully, fingers crossed, getting Senator Sanders to sign on.
Yeah, no, we on the memo itself will have the legislation as well as all the co-sponsors. We combed through legislation that was introduced in this session and the previous session, and it's pretty consistent in terms of the folks who have been co-sponsors of it. So highly recommend reaching out to those. But it's good that you have already an established relationship with the chairman of the committee in order to kind of get things rolling, because we do see aspects of it just kind of very separated in other pieces of legislation. We just think it's possible to get a consensus from all these folks that are already involved in this sphere of work. So really happy to hear that. But yeah, we got very into the granular details of all the recommendations and some of the aspects of it that we're able to touch on, since it's so in the weeds on the memo itself.
Awesome. That's super, super helpful. It is going to help us like basically hit the pavement running.
Great. Well, yeah, we'll send the recording afterwards as well. Glad Pete was able to briefly join in.
Just to prove that I'm not, that he is actually on a road trade in Vermont.
If there's any questions you have regarding the PowerPoint or any topics of which, perhaps we haven't touched on here and you just want to make sure it's on the memo itself, please let us know. We're always happy to add that on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, guys.
Great. Professor, is there anything else?
Nope. So it looks like you guys pulled a lot of good stuff together.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you again, Allison. Please send our thanks to Pete. We'll certainly keep in touch for the next week as well, as we send you all of the rest of our material as well.
Wonderful. Take care, guys. Thank you so much again.
Have a good weekend.
Thank you so much. Have a good weekend.
Take care.
Bye,
Bye-bye.
everyone.